Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, and happy Gregorian New Year. My name is Michael Fraud. I'm the Assistant Program Director here at Drisha. Very excited to be welcoming folks to our first shir of 2021. The blessing of 2021, should one say a bracha when receiving the COVID vaccine with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier. Rabbi Zuckier is our Director of Education at Drisha, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish Studies at McGill University. He received his PhD in Ancient Judaism at Yale University and his smicha at YU, where he was also a member of the Kol Elyon. We are very excited to be starting off the year with this year. Hopefully it is a sign of good things and many vaccines to come. So without further ado, Rabbi Zuckier, feel free to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. And as Michael said, it's the first shir of the year. I'm guessing for most of the people on this Zoom, certainly for me. And hopefully, as the title implies, this will be a calendar year full of blessing. We have a lot to improve upon from last year. So the thought was to begin the year with a blessing, both in the sense that anytime we learn is a bracha, but more specifically to think about a bracha, think about what bracha, if any, one should say on receiving the COVID vaccine. And obviously, the last few weeks have, at least presaged, have indicated what hopefully our healthier, safer future will look like as we've seen the beginning of the rollout of the COVID vaccine. And it's an important question, as for if you want to understand how does one respond religiously to different news, good news, bad news. We've seen a lot, and I've given a handful of shirim over responses to the challenging parts of COVID, and we've seen that in different ways over the last almost 10 months now. But I think this is hopefully a chance to talk about some of the positive aspects, a turning point, an inflection point where things look like they're getting better. How does one respond to that? What religious structures are there for bringing God into that equation? And so we're gonna go through a bunch of sources on this. There's been a handful of discussions among different rabbinic authorities over the last month or so. There's not really much earlier, which is interesting, and we'll see that's discussed in terms of vaccines and bracha. So it's a relatively new discussion. There's not much direct precedent, although of course there are related precedents. So we're going to be looking at sources both classical and extremely recent, and we'll do that by sharing screen. So everyone, I'll do that now. Hopefully everyone's able to follow one way or the other. And as Michael said, you have the handout linked as well. So if you prefer opening it yourself to having the shared screen, that is also an option. Okay, so hopefully everyone sees what we have. So before we get to the specific question about whether one says a bracha or not, it's probably good to talk about getting the vaccine itself, in itself, and as both the mitzvah, the obligation to get vaccinated, and a quick thought on the theological broader import of that. So we're not going to get into the whole topic itself. There are, there's been a lot of people who have said a lot of things about this, but I think the most straightforward view, if you accept, baseline science, as all non-quack doctors seem to do, so it would seem to be that the vaccine has the capacity to save many lives and a minimal risk. I mean, you never know for sure because we've only had experience with it for 10 months or so, but it seems like by all accounts, what we have seen, that the side effects are minor and limited, and therefore the potential upside is obviously huge. So what does one do in such a case, right? What's the Jewish view of a scenario where there's something with minimal if any side effects and a major upside? And I think the answer to that is fairly clear. So source number one, this is the Sefer HaChinuch about the mitzvah of Maken, the mitzvah of building a parapet, a little fence around one's roof so that people don't fall off. And he understands this mitzvah broadly. He says the mitzvah is lahasir michsholim v'hanigafim mikol mishkanosenu. The mitzvah is to remove any stumbling blocks and negef. Negef is a plague, and remove all plagues from all of our dwelling places. That's why we have the verse. You should make a little fence for your roof in order to remove the danger of people falling off and getting hurt. Gets into the details of the building the wall, but his point is it's broader than that. It's not just the mitzvah of building a wall. It's really preventing any sort of michshol or negef, any sort of stumbling block or disease. That is a mitzvah. I say that's a positive commandment. That seems to be what the chinuch says. And if one accepts that, that would mean that getting vaccinated, assuming again that it's safe, and obviously the one's doctor clears them specifically, and there's no specific complications, but given the circumstances that it can save many lives, both one's own life and that of others, and that there's no major downside, it would seem to be that there is a positive mitzvah, a commandment to do that. Even though there's a separate mitzvah of saving lives, of pikuach nefesh for someone who's already sick. This is a case where someone's not sick yet. You're getting vaccinated before you're sick. There still is a mitzvah, a different mitzvah, a mitzvah of preventing danger that would seem to apply. And the Shulchan Aruch cites this as well when he says similarly, mitzvah aseh lasos adam makil gago. A person has a positive commandment to make a fence around the roof. Finally gets into some of the details, but then he says, echoing what we saw in the chinuch, echad agag ve'echad kol davar sheyesh bo sakana v'roy sheyichshel bo adam v'yamos. Any case, not just a roof, any case where there's danger that someone might fall and die. Kigon chaislo be'er b'chatzero ben sheyesh bo maimin she'ein bo maim. If you have a pit, chayiv lasos chuya gavoy yitfach. We need to build this wall or a cover. Kadesh lo yipol ba adam v'yamos. It would apply to swimming pools, presumably also. That there's a mitzvah, a positive commandment to put a fence around your swimming pool, I guess when it's not in use. So that's all relevant to the specific mitzvah. But then he says, any stumbling block of any sort where there's danger to life, mitzvah saseh la'asiro lishamar mimenu lizayar b'davar yaf. It's a positive commandment to remove it, to watch out for it, to be extremely careful. There's a different pasuk building on this idea. If you don't remove these dangers and you leave these possible risk factors in place, you've canceled, you've missed your chance to fulfill this positive commandment of building a makeh, of building a, or maybe hishamar lecha, not exactly clear which mitzvah, either way. The avar below sasim damim, right, and you violated the end of this pasuk, right? The verse says, build a fence. And don't leave blood in your house, meaning don't leave risk of people dying in your house. You would violate that. Now, just for emphasis, the Shulchan Aruch says, anyone who violates these things are similar. The Amar Hareini Masakein Be'atzmi Umala Acherim Alai Bekach. I'm just endangering myself. It doesn't even affect other people. Oh, Eni Makbe Bekach. I'm not worried about the dangers. Makenoso Makas Mardas. The person actually, ironically, they're not concerned about their health and well-being. The punishment for this is the court gives him lashes to enforce his taking these precautions. That's not practiced nowadays, but at least in theory. Obviously, someone who keeps these things gets a blessing. And of course, a vaccine is not just a risk to oneself if one doesn't take it. It's also endangering other people. So it seems pretty clear that there is an obligation both because of the danger to oneself and this mitzvah of makeh, and the danger to others, which people have no right to endanger others. So if you're going outside, you have no, and the vaccine's available and safe as it is, safe that is available not yet for many people. There would be an obligation to do it. Rav Willig said as much. Rav Mordechai Willig of YU gave a shir a week or two ago and said this very explicitly. He says like the Chiyav D'Oraisa, biblical obligation to take the vaccine based on the Sefer Chinuch on makeh. So let's put that aside. We're not going to focus on that, but it's just good to have principles down that this blessing we're talking about is not only a blessing, but also appears to be an obligation. And a theological perspective from Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the Rav, in terms of the idea here that you might think, well, why am I blessing God? Why am I saying a bracha potentially, as we're going to talk about? What happened here is an accomplishment of humanity. It's not God didn't do anything, one might argue. It was the doctors, it was the scientists who developed the vaccine in record time and tested it and rolled it out. And so what does God have to do with it? Why should there be a bracha? So I think this perspective from Rabbi Soloveitchik in The Lonely Man of Faith about the role of Adam the first. He had two different perspectives on Adam that are reflected in the Torah. The idea of Adam as conquering the world by promoting science and applying it would fit with this idea. So let's read a couple of quotes from The Lonely Man of Faith. Man of old, who could not fight disease and succumbed in multitudes to yellow fever or any other plague, could not lay claim to dignity. Only the man who builds hospitals, discovers therapeutic techniques, and saves lives is blessed with dignity. And this is part of the charge. We are created, of course, Adam Arishon, Adam, is created in God's image with this charge, among others, this charge of conquering the world and mastering science and using it to overcome these diseases. It's not just something that people do, it's things people do as a part of their charge, of their divinely imbued charge and very nature. And continuing to the next quote, in doing all this, Adam the first is trying to carry out the mandate entrusted to him by his maker, who at the dawn of the sixth mysterious day of creation addressed himself to man, summoned him to fill the earth and subdue it, conquer or subdue the world. It's God who decreed that the story of Adam the first be the great saga of freedom of man-slave who gradually transforms himself into man-master, meaning instead of being a slave to nature, humanity should become master over nature. While pursuing this goal, driven by an urge which he cannot but obey, Adam the first transcends the limits of the reasonable and probable and ventures into the open spaces of a boundless universe. Right? This untapped potential, boundless potential that I think we've seen here. And as people have mentioned, this is by far the fastest vaccine turnaround. There's something to appreciate here, not only about humanity, but of course, the cause of that humanity, the creator of that humanity. Even this longing for vastness, no matter how adventurous and fantastic, is legitimate. Man reaching for the distant stars is acting in harmony with his nature, which was created, willed, and directed by his maker. These words were written in the 60s. So the space race was at the forefront of everyone's minds. Worth keeping that in mind. It's a manifestation of obedience to, rather than rebellion against God. Thus, in sum, we have obtained the following triple equation. Humanity equals dignity, equals responsibility, equals majesty. Right, so this is human majesty, human greatness, echoing the divine greatness. As humans are in the divine image, this is both the dignity of conquering science and the responsibility of conquering science. And that this is part of our humanity, that our divinely granted humanity. So I think that's a helpful theological perspective as we think about the more specific and maybe even technical issues of what bracha one is to say. It's of course important to keep in mind both that it's important to get the vaccine, of course, and that it's important to see God as tied in with that. So I think this, before we get into the specifics, this point of the need for appreciation is made nicely by Rabbi Ben Greenfield, an article in JTA. They reached out to a few rabbis for perspectives on a bracha or blessing on the COVID vaccine. We're not going to look at most of them because they sort of are more general, but this is one general point that's helpful. One must offer words of praise and blessing to Hashem upon the amazing event of receiving this vaccine. That is clear. There's no question about that, says Rabbi Greenfield. The question is if one should do so using one of the official canonical brachot of our tradition, which would entail uttering God's sacred name. So I think this is the framing for the rest of our discussion. It's clear that one should see in this vaccine, obviously one should appreciate what the doctors and scientists did as well, but one should attribute that to God. I think that would be the standard traditional Jewish view. The question though is, and we're going to get into the details of this, whether one does so saying a bracha b'shemu malchus, whether one accomplishes this by saying a blessing with God's name, which generally we only do with good cause, and we don't just throw that around. We don't say God's name in vain. There may be some idea about that, and maybe the Ten Commandments or something. So that's going to be our question. Should there be a bracha, and if so, which bracha? And this is going to get into some of the details of how the various brachas work. So before we jump into that, just pull back for a second. Any questions, any thoughts, any reflections by anyone here, or are we ready to jump into it? Okay, Jason.
Has anybody addressed the fact that most vaccines are going to have like a 2-week waiting period? So like you're actually not protected with the first vaccine, right? So, or the first shot, right? So should you be saying a blessing on the first shot or the second shot?
We will get there. That is
Okay.
in the discussion. Yeah.
Uh,
So
Also, has anybody said that for, say, young people, like, it seems as if we don't really know the long-term risks for young people. The risk of dying from COVID, even if you contract it, is extremely low. I think
right, hold your question. I think your
okay,
questions will be more relevant to what we get to in a couple minutes. So hold
okay.
that.
I'm
But
sorry.
great questions. But yeah, we'll get there. Any other reflections just on what we've seen so far? All right. If not, we'll jump right back in. And the first question to ask is, if one's going to bless God, if one's going to make a bracha in a formal sense, which bracha should one make? And we have two very good candidates, She'echiyanu and Hatov V'Hametiv. She'echiyanu, I'm guessing some of you have heard of. Right, it's said at many Jewish holidays and upon doing many mitzvos. That's sort of the formalized. There's two versions of She'echiyanu. There's some that are like built into the calendar, and there's also She'echiyanu that one can say upon certain experiences, like as we'll see. So that one's probably better known. Hatov V'Hametiv doesn't exist on any fixed calendar. It only exists in an experiential sense. So it may be less well known, but either way, let's look into these two brachos and try to figure out what's good. Of course, just first talk about the text of it. Right, blessed are you, God, Master of the world, Shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh, who has sustained us and kept us alive and brought us to this time. So sort of the happiness that we've made it to this time, which works well for the calendar Shechiyanus, right? We made it to this time of year, but it also can be on an experience where one's very happy, or one can say, I'm happy that I reached this experience, and thank God in that context. So that's Shechiyanu. And Hatov V'Hametiv, bless you, God, Master of the universe. Hatov V'Hametiv, God who is good and who does good. Tov V'Hametiv. So there's like a two parties there, or two-part, right? God is good and does good. So there's a relational aspect there which will be relevant. Okay, so source number 5 here, the Gemara in Brachos gives us these basic blessings. It's sort of the basic source. Al Geshamim Ve'al Besoros Tovos, on rain or other good tidings. Omer Baruch Hatov V'Hametiv. You say, blessed is the one who is good and who does good, even though it doesn't spell out God's name. That's presumably part of the bracha. Like Gemara usually when it says brachos, doesn't spell it out, presumably for reasons of space. You don't want to waste ink and parchment. So you say the bracha of Hatov V'Hametiv on good tidings or rain. Al Besoros Ra'os, on bad tidings. Omer Baruch Daina Emes. There's still a bracha for that. It's very interesting. We actually saw this, those who were in the series earlier this week on benching Berachos Hamazon. We saw how that came up in some of the sources. But there's a bracha, Baruch Daina Emes, blessed is the true judge, that one says on bad tidings, such as when a relative dies. Bana bayis chadash, if you build a new house, kelim chadashim, you buy new clothes. Omer baruch shechianu v'kiyumanu v'yiganu lazman hazeh. Then you say shechianu. So we have two different relevant brachos here. Obviously, bad news is not relevant for our discussion. But you have two. You have good tidings or rain. You say Hatov V'Hametiv. You have a new house, or you get a new house or a new clothes. You say Shechianu. So what exactly is the difference here? So the Shulchan Aruch spells out some of these differences, and the main sources we're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch are in Orach Chaim Reish Kaf Aleph, Reish Kaf Beis, Reish Kaf Gimel. That's where he discusses a lot of these brachos of Birchos Hodad, these blessings of thanks to God. Okay, so let's start here. And as the Gemara said, rain is sort of the classic example. So we're going to talk a little bit about rain. It says, Imhaya b'tsa'ar, if one was in pain and difficulty because of the drought, machmas atziras geshamim, v'yardu geshamim, right, there's a drought, one's in pain, one's in trouble, and then it starts raining. Mivarchim aleim, you say a bracha, afal pi shelo yardu adayin kidei revia, even though they didn't yet have the sufficient rain, right, sort of the start of the rain. It didn't rain for a while, now it starts, and it hasn't yet, done what it needs to do, but it started. One says a bracha at that point. Hold that thought. Mishayardu kol kach sherabu ala aretz sheyalu ababuos min amatar v'yelchu zelikrazeh. At what point does one start saying the bracha that we're going to say in a second? When there's water on the ground to the point where there are bubbles coming up, right? Air bubbles, right? Because the water sort of traps air, and then the air bubbles come up as the water goes down. So the water is starting to enter the ground, bringing up bubbles that approach one to the other. The bubbles approach one another. What does that mean? That means that the water is starting to seep in. So that's when one says the bracha. Haggadah, the Rama says, he comments, right? He points out nowadays, and when he says nowadays, he means nowadays in Europe, we don't say this bracha on rain because in our countries, there's always rain. There's no real droughts. It's not really a major issue. So we'll get to this a bit later. The Rama in a few places has this concern about not making too many brachas, about holding back. And we'll see how that plays itself out. But hold that thought for now. Uma mevarich. We're getting more to our point. What bracha does one say? Im ein lo sadeh, if you don't have a field, Omer, you say the following. You don't say a bracha. If you don't own a field personally, you don't say a bracha. We'll get to that later. It needs to directly affect you. But what do you say instead? Thank you, God, for every drop of rain that you brought down. If our mouths were full of praise, and then it sort of says the nishmat, right? Ad hein yodu v'yivarchu shimcha malkeinu. The text from Nishmas about thanking God for all the good things that God does in nature. V'chosem baruch Hashem kel rov haodos. Right, and at the end you do say a bracha, God of great thanks, specifically on rain. This is a special bracha only for rain that doesn't have broader context. This is if you don't own a field. What if you do own a field? If you own a field, you co-own a field with someone else. Then you say atov v'ametiv. We'll get to that why in a second. If you own a field but no one else co-owns it with you, and we generally assume that family members count as co-owners. So if you're a single person who owns a field, then mevarich shechianu. So why is there that difference? We'll get to that in a second. Haggadah Rama points out the hashomeh sheyard yiksham mevarich hatov v'ametiv. Yesh omer. Right? He says some think that you actually say hatov v'ametiv if you hear that it rains, but that's not the standard view. And then if we move to source 7, the next line in the Shulchan Aruch, al shmuel shein tovos lo levado mevarich shechianu. News that's good just for you, you say shechianu. But imheim tovos lo ula acherim. But if the news is good not only for you but for others, mevarich hatov v'ametiv. This seems to be our rule, right? So if you own a field alone by yourself, it's good news for you. It's shechianu. If you co-own a field, then it's hatov v'ametiv because it's not just good for you; it's good for others. Why would that be the distinction? So this goes back to the two-party nature of hatov v'ametiv, right? God is not only good, God's self, but God does good to others. So this relational aspect, just like there's a relation between God and the people God does good to, similarly, there's this other factor of the relationship between me, the person who's saying the bracha, benefiting, and someone else benefiting. If both I and the other person are benefiting, then that's sort of like hatov v'ametiv. It's good for me and it's good for others, just like God is good and God does good for others. It seems to be that there's like a mirroring there in terms of why this bracha is said in that case. In any event, it would seem like, so on this basis, what does everyone think? Assuming one says a bracha on vaccine, we'll talk about whether or not. Which bracha would it be? Shechianu or hatov v'ametiv? What do people think? Based on our criterion.
Hatov v'ametiv, maybe, because when I'm getting the vaccine, I'm protecting myself, but I'm also protecting others, like herd immunity kind of logic.
Yeah. So that's a point that many have said, and seems pretty convincing. We'll get into more detail in a second, but it seems pretty convincing that my getting vaccinated is certainly good for me, but it's also good for everyone else. That's right. As Jason said, that's the whole idea of herd immunity. That if only I got vaccinated, I actually still be at risk. If other people get vaccinated too, that decreases my risk because the spread is limited. Fine. So it would seem to be based on this standard that hatov v'ametiv would be preferable. Okay, and despite our usual standard here, it is worth noting from the next source number 8. We'll just jump to the end. Yesh is a poskim mitzvah the hechesh tzarich levarich birchas hatov tzarich gam levarich shechian. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong part of the line. Oh yeah, so we'll start at the beginning. Ordinarily yoser da afilu das a poskim the yuchal levarich hatov v'ametiv afilu hachi I birich shechianu lo havi levatala. According to the view that you say, there's a view that even when you're supposed to say hatov v'ametiv, if you say shechianu instead, it's not a bracha at all. It's not a wasted bracha. It also counts. Just like saying a hadama on a fruit. So you shouldn't do that ideally, but it's not a bracha levatala. The bracha still works. The bircha shechianu huncha al simcha shel atzmo. Right? You're still enjoying. It's not like you're not happy with the news. You are happy. You are happy and benefiting from the news. It's just that other people are also benefiting. So hatov v'ametiv is maybe the preferred bracha. But if you do shechianu, it's not a problem. You didn't do anything wrong. You just didn't do the maximal. You didn't do the most precise bracha. So keep that thought in mind. And right. Right. So Rav Rimon, Rav Yossi Rimon, we'll get to these contemporary posek in Israel. We'll get to a couple more of his thoughts later. He points out that there's another difference between Hatov V'Ametiv and Shechianu. Hatov V'Ametiv, you're only supposed to say on things that are directly benefiting you. You don't say it on something that's non-tangible, non-physical. You only say Hatov V'Ametiv on a tangible physical thing, like, for example, I don't know, rain, or something like that, or inheriting something. That's there's like a financial gain. But in our case, ulam shechianu nitan levarich gam al dvarim elu. You can say shechianu even on non-material things, right? That's just the nature of shechianu. Shechianu stems more from one's being happy, whereas hatov v'ametiv it stems from something good happening to you, right? Metiv, God does good. God did good to me, right? Whereas shechianu is not tied into something good happening. It's just tied into one's own excitement, one's own happiness. So that is another difference. But he says, the vaccine is physical. We know that, right? They stick something into your arm and then you get antibodies. Something physical is going on. So that would seem to not be an issue. And you can say Hatov V'Ametiv, although we'll actually see Rav Rimon himself has other considerations to maybe shift that. But at least for now, it seems like Hatov V'Ametiv would be the bracha to go with if one goes with a bracha. But as we're going to see, there are multiple possible objections that people have raised to the idea of saying a bracha. Again, not the idea of blessing God in general, which I think everyone's on board with. Everyone who accepts the basic science is on board with. But the idea of saying it with a bracha with God's name, which generally they're pretty high stakes. We don't believe in saying God's name in vain. So should one do it in this case or not? So Rav Shlomo Aviner a couple of weeks ago had published a piece where he pointed to a bunch of reasons why one might doubt the value of, or doubt that it's ideal to say God's name. So he has a few arguments. One is it's a medical procedure. What precedent do we have for medical procedures? So he says, Birkat Rofei Cholim v'Birkat HaGomel. We actually have other blessings that are a precedent for medical procedures. One is Baruch Rofei Cholim, blessed is the healer of the sick, similar to the Bracha and Shmon Esrei. And he says, Rav Kook said, Rav Kook, the important Israeli rabbi, who certainly Rav Aviner sees as maybe his main teacher in a bunch of ways, or a teacher's teacher. So he said one should say this Baruch Rofei Cholim, and if you had a real surgery that involved bleeding, then Misha Simon Nituach Pashut Shemerech B'Shem Malchut Kmo B'Achazatam. If you have a surgery, you should say this bracha with God's name. That's the bracha to say, not a bracha of Hatov V'Ametiv or Shechianu. Or he doesn't even talk about Hatov V'Ametiv. He just talks about Shechianu. But the logic would be the same either way. So he thinks that's one reason that one wouldn't say Shechianu, because one should instead be saying Baruch Rofei Cholim. Although Baruch Rofei Cholim wouldn't really apply here because one isn't getting healed, one is getting vaccinated. That's a different. One's getting inoculated against the future potential danger. So you wouldn't say this Baruch Rofei Cholim, but since in general in medical issues one says Baruch Rofei Cholim, but not Shechianu, maybe that's a reason not to say Shechianu here. Rav Avram Stav, who's is also an Israeli rabbi. I was in yeshiva with him, so he had a sort of response essay where he pushed back on some of Rav Aviner's points, and he says, right, he makes the point that we sort of said that brachot elu nitkanu avur adam shayach olev nitrapeh lo al tipul monea. The bracha of Rofei Cholim is someone who gets healed, not someone who gets inoculated. So that actually wouldn't make sense. And he points out that given that you're not saying this other bracha, that would be reason to say Shechianu, meaning he sort of implies the only reason why one doesn't say Shechianu when having surgery is because instead one's saying Baruch Rofei Cholim. That sort of replaces the Shechianu. But if for whatever reason you're not saying Baruch Rofei Cholim, for example, it's not healing you, it's inoculating you, then you should say a bracha of Shechianu. So that was his pushback on that point. Another possible objection is that, of course, as we just mentioned, it's only an inoculation. You're not actually healing someone. You're preventing them from getting sick. And Rav Aviner notes, throughout history, there have been many different vaccines that have been developed, I guess especially in recent history. And he says, Zolo apam harishona b'historia shem tziu chisun neged nagif, Baruch Hashem, right? Thank God, this is not the first time there's a vaccine to stop a plague. For example, the influenza vaccine, right? 100 years ago, that I actually don't know when exactly they developed it, but it did. At whatever point it was developed, it did limit that disease, and of course, it's still used today. But he says, El b'meshech hashanim, they're all different treatments. V'lo ra'inu she'ravotenu katvu levarech shechianu alehem. We never saw our rabbis say a shechianu on a vaccine. So maybe that's why. So maybe there's no reason to say it now, given the precedent that there was no bracha on vaccines previously. And Rav Stav responds, well, there's a difference between the vaccine you take every year, let's say your flu shot or your measles vaccine or whatever it is, and this case. Because in this case, right, your measles vaccine, you sort of don't think about it. You go to the doctor, you get the shot. It doesn't affect your life in a way that you can see because you sort of take it for granted. Whereas in this case, the COVID vaccine, for many people, they're living their lives extremely different the last 10 months than usual. And getting the vaccine allows them to a large degree to get back to normal. So that is right, that motziat adam min hamigbalot hakvedot shenichvu alav. This frees someone from the heavy limitations that were placed on him. That would be a reason to say a shechianu, different than a usual vaccine. And I don't know what he would say. Presumably, if there were a vaccine in the middle of a pandemic in the past to stop the pandemic immediately, one should get that too. But maybe that's not how things developed. I would guess that vaccines came later, after many years, not in a way that directly affected people's behavior the way that this would, that allow you to get back to normal right away. So that's a second objection and a potential parry. A third objection is that resolving a bad situation. Do you say a bracha? Do you say shechianu when it's not that something good happened? It's that something bad was prevented from happening. So Rav Aviner says, "Anu lo mevarchim al davar tov sheyatzah midavar ra." If you go yitziat, that's typo, mi beit ha'asurim v'kabbalat get. He says we don't generally say a bracha on something good that happened when the only thing good that happened is that it's the end of a bad situation. For example, leaving jail, right? There's nothing inherently good about leaving jail. The good thing is that you're not in jail anymore. It's ending something bad. Or receiving a get, which is ending, presumably, a bad marriage. So you don't say a bracha on those things because it's not a positive, it's removing a negative. And he quotes Rav Zilberstein, important Haredi posek in Israel, who says this. This argument can be seen. Before we get to that, actually, let's jump to the response from Rav Stav, who says that actually Rav Zilberstein says that, but his brother-in-law Rav Chaim Kanievsky disagrees. A different Haredi posek also says that one should say a bracha on leaving jail or on receiving a get. One should say a shechianu on that because it doesn't matter that it's ending a bad situation. It's still, one's happy. It's a good thing that happened. One should say a shechianu. So there's a debate among contemporary poskim, but I think, as Ray Linzer pointed out, this actually can be seen as a dispute among earlier poskim. Think about the Shulchan Aruch we saw before, right? There's a drought and then it rains. So how would you describe that situation? Right? It sounds like a drought and then it rains is ending a bad situation, right? It's not like something good per se. It's sort of, you're returning to baseline. Every year you assume there's enough rain to sustain the crops. That's the whole reason why you planted the crop. There wasn't rain, a bad thing happened. There's a drought, and then the drought ended. So that should be the same as ending something bad. And yet the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara says you say a bracha. So that should be so. Apparently, you do say a bracha. You do say a shechianu on ending something bad. That would be a straightforward reading of the Shulchan Aruch. But the Aruch HaShulchan has a different reading. He says Yardik Rishamim Rabim. That piece in the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch that quotes the Rambam is the the im yiridas hagashamim mimutza kamo b'kol hashanim ein tzarich bracha. Al hagashamim merubim, then you say a bracha. Right? He says you actually, if it's a drought and you don't have any rain and you're in bad shape, and then it rains the normal amount that it rains, you actually don't say a bracha according to the Aruch HaShulchan. Only if the rain is greater than the normal year, then there's something extra. There's some extra blessing. Then you say shechianu. But if all the rain does is it restores you to, sort of the default setting, to what you expected to begin with, a normal year's rain, that's not a reason for a shechianu. So it seems like the Aruch HaShulchan would accept this objection of Rav Aviner that you wouldn't say a shechianu on a vaccine because you're just stopping something bad. Whereas the straightforward reading of the Shulchan Aruch would say that you do. Of course, it's no different than rain ending a drought. So that's another case where there's a dispute as to whether one should say a bracha or not. Now, another issue is the potential negative outcome, possible side effects. Well, we'll get to side effects in a bit, but at least, let's say long-term risks. And of course, this is something that as far as scientists can tell, there's no major long-term risks, but there's obviously been no study for longer than 10 months done on the vaccine, or maybe 11 months, whatever it is. There's just not enough time. So in theory, there's no reason to think this, but theoretically, there could be some longer-term downside that Rav Rimon is actually worried about. He says, there's some downside as to something might happen from it. Again, I don't know if I would say chashot kvedim. That seems a bit overstated, but so then the question is, let's assume that were the case. Well, let's assume there were some long-term negative potential downsides, which again I don't think is a fair assumption. But if one were to say that, what should you do then? Does that stop you from saying would that stop you from saying shechianu? So he says, well, you might think about this Shulchan Aruch, source number 18, where we say Meis Aviv Mevarich Dainamis. If one's father dies, one says Baruch Dainamis, blessed is the true judge. Haylo Mamon Yarshu, if you inherit money, Im Eino Achim Mevarich Gam Ken Shechianu. You don't have siblings to say a Shechianu because assuming it's a significant thing, it's a windfall. Right? You're just like if you would win the lottery. There's in terms of your financial situation, you're in better shape. So that's a reason to say Shechianu. Because you're sharing in the good. So it seems like we have a precedent for even if something bad is happening, the fact that something else good is happening is still reason to say a Shechianu or Hatov V'Ametiv. So he says, no, that's different. In the case of one's father dying, there's the downside. It's clearly bad that one's father died, obviously, and it's clearly good that one inherited the money. Those are two separable things that are clearly good and clearly bad. You don't know, again, assuming there's a real risk, which doesn't seem warranted on a medical level, but if one were to say that, it seems to be good, but you never know. It may actually turn out in retrospect that the vaccine was bad and the big picture. So that's why he's worried about not saying it. Again, I think the main objection to this view is the science, that there's no real risk. But there's another objection one could suggest based on source number 19. Again, a similar place in the Shulchan Aruch, talking about when one says Bracha Mevarich Tova Tova Metiv, Af al pi sheyare shema yavo ra mimenu. You say Tova Metiv even if you're worried about a certain risk. It's explicit in the Shulchan Aruch. Even if you're worried that there'll be some risk from what you're doing, that it won't work out, you still say Shechianu or Atov V'Ametiv, depending on the case, if it seems like it's good. If your basic assumption is I'm doing this seems like it's really good news, I should say a Shechianu. And his examples are right? You find some, I don't know, you find whatever, you find a lot of money lying around, you find a diamond lying around, that seems to be good news. But if the king finds out and puts you in jail or takes all your money, then that's really bad news, right? So you don't know actually if finding the diamond was good or bad, but your default assumption is it's good, and you say a Shechianu or a Tov V'Ametiv. So that would seem to undermine Rav Rimon's argument, not only on the science but also on the halacha as well. Fine. Moving on to another possible objection. This Rav Asher Weiss, an important posek in Israel, who recently published an article, lengthy article, mostly about the next issue number 6, which we're going to get to in a second. But one of his points is that painful experiences, it's not clear if you say a Shechianu on painful experiences. As he says, Ein mevarchim kevan sheyesh bo tsa'ar in certain cases, and certainly, and that's true even by certain cases that are a mitzvah to say the bracha. Kal v'chomer leberachas harishus she'ein levarach b'makom sheyesh bo tsa'ar. Certainly in a case where it's an option, right? It's not like right, let's say there's, as was mentioned before, Shechianu exists in optional and mandatory form, right? Sometimes it's like on a holiday where it's a chiyuv, it's an obligation to say it, not just that one has an experience. It's sort of a situational, optional thing. So certainly, if even in some cases of obligation, one doesn't say Shechianu if it's painful. It's painful to get a vaccination. They stab you in the arm. Your arm is sore potentially for a couple of days. You may get some headaches or fevers. That response of your immune system. It's a good thing, but it's not fun. It's painful. So that, he says, is a reason not to say the Shechianu because of the painful experience there. And then he also talks about the Shulchan Aruch we saw about inheriting. Right, your father dies. you inherit money, you still say a shechianu. It's obviously painful that your father died. No, that's not relevant. The shani hasam, the mevarich al shnei yanim in the father. Those are two separate things. Obviously, one triggered the other, but they're two separate experiences you have. So that wouldn't be relevant to this, where the shot itself causes both pain and long-term positives. Fine. And Ray says, even though at a bris we say a shechianu, that's because it's an obligation. But that in a case where it's an option, one wouldn't say shechianu. So that's what Rasher Weiss is. That's his main objection. And on this basis, well, in combination with the next one, he's actually opposed to saying a bracha along with Rav Aviner based on this argument. Let's look at the next argument. Oh, this another smaller issue before we get to the larger issue of number 7, that it's not a new item. Rasher Weiss points out, usually, remember what our cases are, right? Like a new house, new clothing, that sort of thing. A new fruit, that's in the Shulchan Aruch here in the source 22. Or new wine. Usually say a bracha on a new thing that you now see. So, but not on good news. So is the vaccine a new thing? Are you excited about the vaccine itself? You see the vial, now you're excited? Or is it not the item of the vaccine, but it's sort of the broader news that now you and others are going to be safer? So that's another objection, potentially. And he's especially drawing on a line in the Mishnah Berurah that he cites and included here in source 23. Today we minimize saying brachos of hatov v'ametiv or shechianu on shmos tovos, on good news, right? Even though the Shulchan Aruch says that you do say shechianu on good news, right? That was in the Gemara too. When you hear good news, you say shechianu, even if it's not one of the classic examples of new clothes, new fruit, whatever. But he says we've minimized that. Our minhag, our practice is to minimize that. We're going to see that in a minute. And that's why one should stay away from it in this case, especially because it's not one of the classical examples. So it's painful. It's not a classical example because it's not a new thing. It's more of a more news than a thing. And this feeds into what I call brachaphobia, which is, I guess, a broader generalization of that last point, that there's been a trend among at least some poskim to sort of move away from brachos, move away from saying certain brachos, out of fear for saying God's name in vain. You don't want to say God's name in vain, that's bad. So, when in doubt, do without. And even if, you look in the Gemara, you look in the Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like there's real, the idea is, when you're sufficiently happy about some scenario, you should say a bracha, or some good news happens, you should say a shechianu or a tov v'ametiv. There seems to be a move away from that because of greater fears of bracha v'atal. So let's see. This actually starts in it starts in the Ramah already. So let's look at this. Source 24, Shulchan Aruch, again, the same context, Reish Kaf Gimel. Yalda ishto zachar mevarich hatov v'ametiv v'gam hi tzricha levarich kain. If a woman has a baby boy, and then there's a hatov v'ametiv, right, for the wonderful news that are good for multiple people, for the whole family. V'gam hi tzricha levarich kain. Both the husband, the mother, and the father, or I guess, the mother and the father say hatov v'ametiv in such a case. What about a girl? There's not in the Shulchan Aruch, but there's a whole halachic literature. It seems to be that one can say a bracha on a girl as well, whether it's hatov v'ametiv or shechianu, but that's not our topic for now. The Ramah says, "V'mesa ishto b'leidasa mevarich shechianu." Even if one's wife dies in childbirth, the husband says shechianu. Daleka hatav l'achrin. It's only good for you, not good for her, because you're the only parent of the child. And the same if the father dies, fine. But then the Ramah says as follows: V'yesha kazvu shenagu lahakel bebrachazu. Some have written that we should be lenient in this bracha, meaning we should minimize saying this bracha. She'ena chova el rishus. It's just an option. It's not an obligation. It's not. One doesn't have to say the bracha, but one sort of a nice thing one should do, and it's an option. It's a good option, but since it's not obligatory, people should avoid it. That's been a practice. Many people are lenient with these brachas not to say them, which I'm guessing. This is not. I'm guessing people have heard of saying a shechianu on holidays, but probably haven't heard of saying a shechianu or saying a hatov v'ametiv on having children. It just seems to be less practice nowadays, presumably because of this Ramah and similar views of minimizing brachos for fear of saying God's name in vain. So this objection was raised both, as we saw, in some form by Rav Asher Weiss, also by Rav Aviner, although with a bit of a twist. It says Masha Nagu Nagu. What they did, they did. What they've practiced, they practiced. He quotes the Chassam Sofer, the early 19th century, who wrote about shechianu, hecha de lo nahig, where it's not practiced, it's not practiced. Hecha de nahig nahig, ve'arich, and where it is practiced, it's practiced and good. I'm not worried about saying a bracha levatala. I'm not really worried about saying God's name in vain. You should just do what's practiced normally, do the normal minhag. And of course, you can take this in one of two directions. Rav Aviner says, it seems like here, there have been many different solutions, as was mentioned, different vaccinations, and we don't have a bracha. So it seems like the default is not to make the bracha. Whereas Rav, I included here, Rav Stav pushed back and said, wait, let's focus on the other part of what the Chassam Sofer said, which is chash bracha levatala leika. There's no real worry about saying a blessing in vain. There's no real, you can't really mess up. What are you doing wrong? If you say an extra bracha and you're actually happy, you didn't do anything wrong. So that was his reason to go in the opposite direction. Rabbi Yossi Levine of the Jewish Center in New York, in that JTA article, said there's an argument about whether to say the bracha on the COVID vaccine. Obviously, we should be very happy about it. But he says we typically adopt a minimalist approach to brachot. Maybe that would be the more charitable way of putting it, a minimalist approach to brachot rather than brachaphobia. We tend to follow precedent. We might say the list of occasions that call for bracha shechianu is fixed. As such, from the perspective of Jewish law, the best practice would be to recite the bracha while omitting the name of God. Right? This is the minimizing risk view. And we'll get to some of those in just a second. If you don't say God's name, you can't say God's name in vain. Right? That's a good solution. It's a fail-safe. If you never say God's name, you're never going to say it in vain. Of course, on the other side, there's a risk of not appreciating God sufficiently if you're not willing to invoke God's name directly in the thanks. But this is a significant pushback. I think anyone who comes out against saying the bracha, like Rabbi Levine or Rav Asher Weiss or Rav Aviner, this is probably the main force. He may have other additional reasons to doubt whether there's cause for it or not. But at the end of the day, I think the main force behind it is this minimalist approach to brachot, also known as brachaphobia. That lies behind it. Okay, there's a few different ways of hedging one's bet. We just saw Rabbi Levine. One way, a very easy way, is just not to say God's name. Say Baruch Hatov V'Ametiv instead of Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Hatov V'Ametiv. You've hedged your bet. Rav Aviner has a different hedge. Beged o pri chadash. Have a new fruit or new clothes. Right, wear a new shirt while you get your vaccination, and then say your Shechianu on the shirt, because the shirt is on our canonized list of things that you say a bracha on. So that would be a solution, or a new fruit. That's one hedge. Rav Asher Weiss said similarly, a similar hedge to have your fruit or whatnot. Rav Avram Stav had a variation on this I thought was very interesting, which is, he said if you're worried, he himself gave a lot of reasons why there may be a good basis for saying Shechianu. But he said if you're worried about these objections, what one should do is say the Shechianu after their vaccination when they first see their friend, because the Gemara also talks about if you see a friend who you haven't seen in person in a while, you say a Shechianu. We discussed this a couple weeks ago in a class. So wait until then and say your Shechianu. And then your Shechianu is going not only on seeing your friend, but also on the fact that now you're seeing your friends in person because you got vaccinated. So that would be, in his view, that's another hedge. Or you're saying it on the broader phenomenon of the vaccination and seeing your friend without the worries that on the vaccination itself it would be a problem. Rav Rimon, so he actually wrote two different versions. The first piece was sent out informally, is in source 30, and then the published piece, which I only saw this morning, came out later, is in source 31. So we'll take a look at a couple of points he raised. He said that he in his position he sort of pointed to some objections one might have, and he says better to, if you're going to say a bracha, imratzal levarech, adif levarech dafka shomea shechisun higil artzo. Better to say the bracha when you hear that the vaccine is around, that the vaccine is available, maybe available to you, maybe available in your country, whatever it is, because then you're happy, and that's a reason to say the bracha. Even if you shouldn't say the bracha on getting the vaccination, probably hearing good news of this sort is reason to say the bracha. Of course, this is exactly what Rav Asher Weiss objected to, this idea of Shmos Tovos based on the Ramah based on the Mishnah Berurah that we saw, that we minimize Shmos Tovos. But Rav Rimon here in this first suggestion said that maybe it's better to say it on hearing the news. In source 31, he writes, he thinks there's good reason to say Hatov V'Ametiv, but he's a little worried about some of the objections, and maybe it's not really fine. And therefore he says Tov yoter levarech birkat shechianu. Right, remembering what he said before. Usually you say Hatov V'Ametiv on a new item that you get, a new product, a new thing, and it's not clear. It's not clear what exactly the thing is. Are you happy about the vaccination? Are you happy about the change in lifestyle now? So therefore, it's better to say Shechianu, because you can always say Shechianu when you're happy. And if you're happy and you know it, as the Jewish saying goes, say Shechianu, as we sing to our to little kids all the time. So that's Rav Rimon's point, is that a hedge is to not say a tova metiv, because then you're sort of, a tova metiv is only on a good item, and you're not so sure about this item's goodness, maybe because of doubts about the medicine, although that seems dubious. More likely just because, are you happy about the vaccination, or are you happy about the return to a normal lifestyle? And for that reason, say a shechianu, which is based on being happy and you're all safe. Let's quickly look at a few alternative options people have raised. Some have raised the option of saying hagomel, which is usually said after one, let's say, is in danger and then is saved from danger. Rabbi Dov Linzer of YCT says that doesn't really make so much sense because you never really were in danger. I mean, number one, it's not one of the four classic cases, being in jail, overseas, etc. But he says more to the point, you don't have COVID. You weren't in danger. It's like, it's there's a joke people like to tell. If you hung up your pants on a clothesline, and then there was a tornado and swept your pants away, and they're gone, but you were safe. You were holed up in your bunker, totally fine. So you just say agomel, because you might have been in your pants, right? That's not how that's not how agomel works, right? So that's basically the objection here, that you weren't actually in danger, right? I mean, maybe if you were in danger, if you actually were, I don't know, working in a hospital, then maybe, Ray Lynch says maybe then it would be different. I'm not even sure about that. If you never contracted the disease, it's hard to say that you got better from the disease, because you didn't. So that's hagomel. Seems that there's no good reason to say hagomel, but other brachas or other things, non-brachas, are possible, especially for the views that say you shouldn't say a bracha. So there's a Yehi Ratzon. The Gemara talks about a Yehi Ratzon prayer to say upon getting a medical procedure. It's actually talking about hakazas dam, bloodletting, which we don't do so much nowadays, but the principle is the same. So hanichnas hakazas dam, one who goes in for a procedure of bloodletting, Omer, he says as follows: Here it's all from Hashem Elokai, may it be your will, Hashem my God. This procedure should be for good health, and it should heal me, because you are a true healer, and your healing is truth. And then they add, you should also say Baruch Rofei Chinam. After the practice, you should also say blessed is the free healer, or maybe the Shulchan Aruch has Baruch Rofei Cholim, blessed is the healer of the sick. Whatever it is, there's some version of what to say. What I saw some people sending this around. That version of the bracha is what one should say. So that's an alternative. Again, if you're not going to say not a bracha, Yehi Ratzon. If you're not going to say a bracha, Yehi Ratzon is a decent alternative. There's no, since it's not in the formula of a bracha, you can't really violate the prohibition of saying God's name in vain, even if it was wrong. So that again is limits your exposure, so to speak. Although it's a vaccination, so it's actually all about exposure. But that's a different issue. Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, a rabbi in Israel, had formulated a slightly different Yehi Ratzon. Everyone should feel free to read it on their own time, or as a modim, thank you, and the Yehi Ratzon, and please heal the sick, etc. Again, without a bracha. That's an alternative. And then other people have suggested other alternatives. Right? Linzer said maybe you should say nishmat, which we saw in the Shulchan Aruch mentioned, right? This idea of God, all the good that God does in the world. Rav Rimon says you might as well say something like Mizmor L'Soda, or Mizmor Shachar Savais David, or Nishmas as well. Something praising God. There's no downside in saying a parak of Tehillim that praises God for the natural order, etc. What about timing? We're getting now to some of the issues that Jason raised before. At the shot or not? Do you do it while you're getting the shot or not? There's a few potential times one might do it: when the vaccine is being distributed, once it's already sort of kicked in, or when the person receives it themselves. We're not going to have time to delve into this in full detail, but there's two factors. One is, when is one happy? Presumably one's happiest when they get the shot. That's usually how people work, but that's a little bit subjective. The other factor is what qualifies. So generally, as we said before, with the rain case, right? If it rains and you don't have a field, you don't say Shechianu or Atov Ametiv. You say this other special bracha on rain, but you don't say Shechianu or Atov Ametiv. Why? Because you only say Shechianu or Atov Ametiv if it affects you directly. So that would seem to indicate that here, if it's not around you, something about your experience getting the shot, but once herd immunity is reached, that's not a physical item that affects you. So you wouldn't say a bracha on that. You can be very happy. And according to Rav Rimon, you'd say Shechianu. But certainly if you want to say Hatova Meitiv, it would seem that you should only say it on it when it affects you directly, which would be at the time of getting the shot. Fine, and right, the Bir Halacha spells this out a bit. If your good friend who's a tzaddik has a baby, should you say a Shechianu or not, or Hatova Meitiv? Sefer Hasidim, the mystical German text of the 13th century, says that you should, but mainstream psak is that you should not, because it doesn't affect you directly, so you don't say Hatov Ha'metiv. So it seems like both on the factor of when you're happiest and on the factor of affecting you directly, the best time to do it is when you get the shot, although there may be a little wiggle room there. We're not going to go into all those details. What about the first shot or the second shot? As Jason said, one doesn't become fully immune immediately. You actually don't become immune at all immediately, right? Your body has to fight it off. And there's two shots, right? You get like 80% immunity after one shot and then like 95 after the other, something like that. So how does this work? And so we can look at the source here, right? The Gemara talks about al geshamim hatov ha'metiv mevarich amar Rabbi Abo amar Lasnisa me'emus mevarachim geshamim mishe yatsa chasam likras kala. As we saw this before, you say the bracha once the rain hits the ground. The way the Gemara calls when the bride meets the groom, which is interpreted by the Rambam as meaning when the bubbles on the ground from the rain start meeting one another. There's a lot of air bubbles, meaning there's a lot of rain on the ground. Presumably that's like a fertility metaphor, right? When the chassan meets the kala, like the earth starts getting the rain in it. In any event, the way this works is it's when the ground starts getting the rain, right? Obviously, when the rain hits the ground and the bubbles start coming up, your land is still not able to grow the plants. It's going to take a little while before the water kicks in and hits the roots, and then it starts growing. You don't have your result immediately, but the point is it's the beginning of the process. So Rabbi Linzer points out, based on this, you say the bracha at the beginning of the process, which is when you get the shot, the first shot. That's the beginning of the process. Yes, it'll take a couple weeks to kick in. Yes, there's a second shot down the line, but you're embarking on this process of getting better, and you've accomplished a lot of it already. So that's the time to do it. So that is the content here. Just a quick conclusion, a summary of some of the main views that we saw. Rabbi Dov Linzer, in his essay, argues for saying Hatov Ha'metiv. That's his main view, and Rav Hershel Schechter verbally also endorsed that, and he did it himself. He got his inoculation about a week ago and said Hatov Ha'metiv. So that is one major view. Rav Rimon prefers, he says you maybe could say Hatov Ha'metiv, but preferable is to say Shechianu for the reasons he mentioned, that he's worried about the physical experience not being about the physical thing. It's more about your happiness, so that it's safer to say Shechianu. Rav Avram Stav says you can say Shechianu, but it's preferable to have a hedge and say it later when you see your friend. Rav Shlomo Aviner and Rav Asher Weiss say not to say a bracha, and then others, Rav Mordechai Willig, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, suggest saying a Yehi Ratzon instead of a bracha. So that's that's not against what Rav Asher Weiss and others said. And of course, everyone says you can say Tehillim and Nishmas and all sorts of other things, but those are some of the concluding views. It's not my role my goal in this year to tell people what to do. There certainly are major authorities on all the different sides of this. So I guess figure out however you decide your halachic questions. There's what to look into here, and but the most important thing is that however one decides on this technical issue, I think the theological issue is maybe most important. That appreciation for God is a central part of this experience, and the fact that we're hopefully at a point where we're moving beyond this challenging time towards a happier future is cause for reaching out to God in thanks. And I know we didn't have many questions. We're at the hour, but happy to take questions and discussion now as we enter our hopefully a year full of brachos, both on COVID if you make it, and on COVID vaccine I should say if you make it, and more broadly. So I see John put a question in the chat. Would someone like Rav Stav say that a bracha in an uncontroversial case is obligatory and not optional? So generally, it's hard to say this is obligatory. As Rav Asher Weiss pointed out, this bracha is when one has an experience of a certain sort. He goes through a lot of details on this. We didn't have time to get into it, but the standard view is that it's optional. It's an optional bracha, and that's once you say it's optional, then people say, well, it's optional to say the bracha, and there's a risk of bracha vatala. So then it's like an arms race a little bit, right? So the bracha vatala side wins out. But I don't think there are some views that it's obligatory, but we don't seem to paskin like them. We don't seem to rule like them in terms of the consensus. So no, I don't think Rav Stav says it's obligatory. And again, that's why he's well, wait a couple weeks when you see your friend, then that's a good time. He's sort of trying to hedge the bet here. Other questions, or Jason, did I respond to your issues that you raised at the beginning?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what it like for people who have like a very low probability of dying from COVID. Like, do any of the post scheme address that? Like, I know, so for a 50 or 60-year-old, like, it seems as if like the risks of dying of COVID are so high that it's completely nonsense to like the unknown is better than like almost like 20% death. So like. Yeah.
Well, so without getting into the details of what percent, leaving that aside, I think you're raising an important question of subjective, both subjective, the subjective factor of how high one's risk is. So it's like a variable by person, but objectively there's a certain risk, and there's a subjective factor of how one feels about it. So I think everyone would say that the subjective factor is important here. So I would say if someone is not a high risk, right? So let's say someone's young and healthy and they can get sick, but it's extremely unlikely that they'd die, and and they've been living their life basically the same. So they're not experiencing a change in lifestyle when that happens. There are people doing that. I think it's a terrible idea and immoral because you're hurting other people. But fine, if someone's doing that, then there would seem to be no reason to say any bracha, right? Because your risk hasn't really changed, your lifestyle hasn't really. There's nothing to be happy about. So I mean, maybe you should be happy that you're not endangering other people's lives. Maybe that's a good reason, but that's not usually how these brachas work. But I'd say for someone who's let's say not in a high risk category, but they're going to change their lifestyle in a significant way, like they'll be able to do things in person, which I think is many of us, or do more things in person, or see their elderly relatives in person. All of these, I'm not saying you should do that. You should ask your doctor before you do that. But if it's going to change your lifestyle and that makes you happy, then you certainly should say Shechianu. If it's not making you happy, then it's hard to say a bracha, right? I mean, if you're not actually happy about it, that you wouldn't really have the trigger for the bracha. That's a general rule about Shechianus. So I'd say that the subjective factor is important here. Mostly, the main factor being, do you feel happy? And the objective factor sort of takes the backseat to that in some ways, although it's somewhat relevant as well. If someone took the vaccine illegally, can they still say the bracha? Wow. So there's this interesting Gemara in Sanhedrin that talks about, was it Ganav as a Peter, whatever. If someone steals bread and says a bracha, the Gemara says, Ein zeh mevarich ela minayit. That's not blessing, that's cursing. You shouldn't do that. That's a terrible thing. And it quotes the pasuk, Botzea berech niyetz Hashem. The way it interprets it there, a stealer, a robber, blessed and thereby cursed God, right? Sometimes blessing is cursing. Implicating God in your robbery scheme is bad. So I would say certainly someone who willfully took the vaccine illegally, stole it from someone, obtained it through fraudulent means, cut the line illegally, realizing it was wrong, there's good reason to say that they shouldn't say the bracha, with the caveat that Gemara is talking about berachas hanen, and you're saying the bracha on the food itself. Here, are you saying the bracha on the vaccine itself or on your happiness? And that might depend if it's hatov v'ametiv or shechianu, right? Shechianu might be on your happiness detached from the item. Hatov v'ametiv may be on the item. So maybe you shouldn't say hatov v'ametiv on ill-gotten gains. I don't know of any cases. I mean, I know there was a case where the clinic got it fraudulently. So maybe the head of the clinic who got inoculated shouldn't have said a bracha. I doubt he did. But I don't know of any cases of people willfully cutting the line, and hopefully no one should. I think all responsible poskim who weighed in have said people shouldn't. If you do it by accident, there's no question, right? Because you already said the bracha, so it's too late. But yeah, so I would say this is not. I'd say based on that Gemara and Sanhedrin, there's good reason to question whether one should say a bracha if they're doing it illegally. The same way that, right, we mentioned if one inherits a large sum of money, one says a hatov v'ametiv or a shechianu. If one steals a large sum of money, presumably one wouldn't say shechianu, but on their newfound financial situation, right? That would seem to be wrong because stealing is wrong, and so you don't do it. So I think that sounds reasonable. Although I didn't look into this issue, it's a good question I didn't look into. But yeah, hopefully, if someone asks you, I'm about to take the vaccine illegally, should I say a bracha or not? The proper response is don't take the vaccine illegally. So, okay, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well then I think Michael may have an announcement or two. But before that, I just wanted to thank everyone for learning together and hope everyone has a year full of blessing.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckier, for this really, really thorough and fun and fascinating look at all of the material, both that goes into this from older sources, as well as giving a really nice overview of some of the contemporary real-time halachic discussions that are happening around this issue. For folks who are interested in some of our upcoming programs, we are currently in the middle of our Winter's Mind, Not by Bread Alone, Jewish Perspectives on Food. This past week, we have had a number of different sessions, both a morning Gemara shiur as well as afternoon classes and an evening lecture series. We are going to be continuing that through the next week. We have a Yom Yun on Sunday about food ethics. We have 3 different shiurim, one with Dr. Jonathan Crane on Bal Tashchit, the commandment not to waste resources. We have one with Rabbi Aviva Richman on the ethics of meat eating, and we have one with Drisha's own Rabbi David Silber on the man, on manna and its significance for thinking through food ethics. We're going to be following that throughout the week with a continued series of shiurim on the 6th parak of Bracha, thinking about what blessings one would make for food or the consumption or benefit of different objects. We've got afternoon sessions as well. We have an evening series on hunger. So you can find information. I'm going to post some links, but we've got information for the Yom Yun can be found at that link that I just posted. And in addition to that, I'm going to post another link for our Winter's Month as a whole for folks who want, actually, I'll just post, you can find information on all of the different component pieces of Winter's Month at drisha.org/classes. You can choose to sign up for an entire week's worth of programming. You can choose individual classes depending on your schedule, but it's been really wonderful so far. I'd encourage folks to check out some of what we have, and a lot of that will also be streaming on Facebook Live for folks who prefer to follow us there. And stay tuned. We will hopefully very shortly have information coming out about the rest of our spring classes that will be starting up, a little further down the road, but things that will be longer term sessions, weekly shiurim. So please stay tuned for that. But a happy, healthy start to 2021 for everyone. And thank you again for leading us into the new year with some Torah, Rabbi Zuckier.
Be well, everyone.